Media recognition from Bloomberg, Reuters, recycling trade publications. Patented process for 100% recovery of critical metals, including cobalt, lithium, nickel, manganese, aluminum. American Manganese is focused on recycling lithium-ion batteries for electric vehicles. American Manganese trades on the TSX Venture, AMY, the US, AMYZF, and Frankfurt 2AM. For more information, visit AmericanManganeseInc.com or phone me, Larry Ray, at 778-574-4444.
You're listening to HowStreet.com radio, available online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. Welcome to HowStreet.com radio, the online source for market opinions. Here is Jim Goddard.
My guest is Hilliard MacBeth, author of the second edition of the book, When the Bubble Burst, Surviving the Canadian Real Estate Crash. He's also a portfolio manager and financial advisor in Edmonton. Welcome back to the show, Hilliard.
Thank you for inviting me on.
Hilliard, the Real Estate Association claims house prices in Toronto are still climbing, but there really aren't a lot of houses to buy. Is it a shortage of supply that's still pushing up the price when everybody knows everything's overpriced?
I think the listing numbers are way down, and I don't understand why. It could be some people are reluctant to list their houses because they don't want people traipsing through their house because of their fear of COVID. But it could be seller's greed. You know, everybody talks about demand and people outbidding each other, and nobody talks about the fact that sellers can get greedy too. And if they become convinced that prices are going to be 10% higher, 20% higher next year, they just don't put their houses on the market, and they get stubborn. And of course, eventually the house goes on the market because they need to move or they pass away, and the beneficiaries of their estate just want to get it sold to get their hands on the money. But in the meantime, you can have a period, usually only a few months or a year at the most, where sellers just become very reluctant. I mean, if you think your house is worth $2 million and it's only trading at $1.7 million, and it's going up at 10% a year, all you have to do is wait 2 years and it'll be at your price. So there could be some of that going on, but it's very difficult to know. And you know, there's a lot of stories about sold above asking and stuff, but there's a lot of games that are played as well in terms of deliberately underpricing a home when it's listed, so you could say later on that it's sold way above asking.
During the election campaign, and of course, you know, election promises quite often aren't honored. Trudeau said something about ending blind bidding on a house. First of all, does Ottawa have that authority? And do you think that'll happen?
Yeah, I don't think they'll ever get around to that. I don't even know if blind bidding is that common. I mean, it was pretty big deal, I think, when people were buying homes that were, 100 kilometers away and they didn't have a chance to go and look at the home, and they just bid. But when we bought a house in 2007, we had to put in a bid, and we had to try and guess how far above the asking price to put, because the home was obviously listed too low. It was a deliberate tactic by the selling realtor, and I don't think it makes any difference really. It's not a big deal. The big thing, and they did talk about this in the election promises, is the availability of credit, and they mentioned that they would expand the CMHC's ability to offer larger amounts of credit, and that's just going to make the situation worse if they go ahead with that.
What should the politicians have done to make housing more affordable, or could they?
Can they do anything? Well, I don't know about the politicians, but the regulators could do, and it's basically a function of availability of mortgage credit, and the terms and the conditions and the amount. And the former CEO of TD Bank, Ed Clark, who came from Canada Trust, and TD Bank acquired Canada Trust, which was the best thing they ever did. And then he became CEO. He was very skilled executive, and he said that this is back when, a long time ago, but things were overheating even back then, 5 or 6, 7 years ago. He said, we really need the government to tell us to stop making these loans, because if we say no to somebody that's over-levered themselves or about to over-lever themselves, all they'll do is just go down to the next lender on the street, the next bank, and that bank will say yes. So there's no incentive for us to say no. So what he said had to happen was the government, through the regulator, has to order the banks to say no. And if they did, and this would be by limiting the amount of leverage that a household could take on. And my suggestion is to start at 4 times family income and gradually reduce it to 3 times family income. Then that would bring house prices down and we would restore affordability. But that's probably not going to happen. So there isn't really anything the government can do. What's most likely to happen is there'll be a bust, like in many, many other countries and many, many other times. And that'll bring an end to this horrendous bubble that we're in.
The biggest bubble in the world, perhaps, is Evergrande, and I'm being told it's basically a Ponzi scheme. They need new investors to pay off their old ones.
Exactly. The amount of money that they borrowed on the junk bond market in China over the last 5 years is just astounding. The total debts are roughly $300 billion U.S. equivalent. And now, not all of that is U.S. dollar bonds. Only about $30 billion of it is U.S. dollar bonds. The rest of it is owed to lenders who have lent in the local currency in China, and also suppliers that did work but didn't get paid. They got a piece of paper saying that Evergrande owes them so much money. But one of the biggest problems for the Chinese government is this practice it's somewhat similar in Canada, but it's even more extreme in China, where the developer requires that the buyer puts down a deposit before the building is even constructed. So they've got that money in the hands of Evergrande, and they haven't gotten around to building some of the buildings yet. So, but even more radical in China is that they demand that the family puts down the whole amount of the purchase, not just the deposit, but the whole amount, including the mortgage financing. So they go and get their mortgage, they take their savings, their life savings in many cases, and then they put the money with Evergrande, and then they hope eventually that the property gets built. And up until recently, the properties were getting built. And the other weird thing about it is that they don't even move into the property. It's not to be lived in. It's to be held as an investment. And it's better if it never is lived in by anybody, and then it makes it like a better investment. And so it's kind of like getting a wine cellar and buying wine and then waiting for it to age, I guess. But all of that is at a big risk for the government, because those families will be very upset. There's quite a few of them. There's estimates are there's 3 or 4 million of those families just with Evergrande. But I'm sure if Evergrande was doing it, there's a whole bunch of other developers that were doing it as well. It was probably standard practice. So it could be a major factor in causing a lot of social unrest, because in the Chinese system there still is, although it's not a democracy, there still is a thing where there's protesters that come out and complain, and usually what happens is they stage these mass protests, and then eventually the government makes them an offer of some kind of compensation, and then they go quiet again. But this one's going to be a tough one. So far what they've done is they've cut off all of the foreign investors. Basically, it looks like they're going to get nothing. And there's quite a few. There's like $30 billion US dollar debt in hands of foreign investors, about 10% of the total. And they're probably going to help China Evergrande pay off the families that bought houses, and probably the suppliers as well.
A friend of the show, Danielle Park, pointed out last Thursday there's 190 million empty properties in China. So they have a bit of a surplus.
Yeah, but it's not a surplus in the sense that we would consider a surplus if because they were never designed to be occupied. It's a weird thing about their system is there's a feeling that, and this is probably wrong, but it's a widespread feeling that if you keep it empty and keep it pristine and don't touch it, it'll increase in value. And that was probably correct as long as China was growing, their economy was growing. But now, because of their policy of one child that was in place for many years, up until recently, their population is not growing very fast at all. In fact, there's I forget the year, but it's not that far off when China's population starts to shrink. So all of these empty places might turn out to be not a bad investment rather than a good investment. But up until now, people have thought of it as a good investment to have an empty property just sitting there. There's no property taxes in China, so you could sit. I mean, you don't have the use of the money because obviously you've given your money to the property developer. But there aren't any other real big expenses associated with owning it, unlike in Canada where you'd have to pay taxes on it.
And Chinese income tax is incredibly low. A friend of mine who worked there a few years ago said he paid $7 a month in income tax, and so did his coworkers who made a lot less money than he did. So he thinks it might be a flat income tax of $7 a month.
Yeah, you wouldn't hardly notice it at all. So no, it's a system that is probably going to go through some big changes because of China Evergrande and the other property developers. There's another one called Country Gardens. Now it isn't in terrible difficulty yet. Its shares are trading around $10 and they're down around $8, so they've dropped about 20%. But the whole Chinese stock market has dropped partly because of this problem. And the junk bond market. So you can buy bonds in China that are denominated in U.S. dollars. So you don't have the currency risk. All you have is the risk that the borrower can't pay back the money, which now seems like a big risk. You can get 16% interest on that's the average rate of interest on U.S. dollar in the junk bond market in China. But you'd have to be pretty brave to wade into that. I remember when Greek bonds were 30%, and nobody wanted to touch them, and they were denominated in euros. And now the Greek bonds are down to 1 or 2% or even lower. So that would have been a great buy. So it's possible that this is a great opportunity to buy junk bonds in China denominated in US dollars at 16%, but it's only for the very brave, that's for sure.
Is there renewed optimism in Alberta with high oil prices continuing longer into the fall than they usually do?
I don't know if without the ability to transport the oil elsewhere, I think Alberta's already producing pretty close to the maximum that it can. So it doesn't really. It makes a difference to the companies that are selling, but it doesn't actually make much of a difference to the workers in that, because there's not likely to be a whole bunch of money spent to develop even more oil when they're at the maximum capacity of, and there's even a worry with the Enbridge line 3 or 5, that there's a injunction in, I think it's Minnesota, where they might try and get it shut down, or Michigan, yeah. So, there's a lot of problems, and so the optimism is there are lots of people walking around saying, "Oh, we've got another boom underway," but I think they're not as convinced as they used to be. We've had so many booms, and they've all gone into the bust, and I think the ability of people to convince themselves that it's a new boom is limited at this point.
We'll have more with Hilliard MacBeth right after this.
Don't miss out. Stay informed. Receive the HowStreet.com weekly recap with thought-provoking podcasts, radio, and articles delivered to your inbox. Sign up for the HowStreet.com weekly recap on our homepage at HowStreet.com.
Welcome back. We're speaking with Hilliard MacBeth. Hilliard, you're the longest-termed Tesla owner I know, and the company has it turned the corner now. Is it going to be profitable?
It's been profitable for quite a while now, and they just announced their quarterly sales for the period ending September 30th, and they hit the milestone of 240,000 vehicles, which are mostly Model 3s and Ys. The one that I have is the Model S, which is the original model that they made in mass production. But then they brought out a smaller, less expensive model, the Model 3, and then they brought out the crossover edition of that, the Model Y, and those are the ones that are selling, and they're sold. Almost all of those 240,000 in sales are Model 3 and Model Y, which Tesla combines into one number. So we don't know the exact breakout, but so 240,000. So in other words, an annual run rate of close to 1 million vehicles. Now, that's quite small in relation to Toyota or Volkswagen, which we're doing prior to 2020. They were doing around 10 million vehicles, and the total sales in the world were 100 million vehicles. So 1 million is 1% of the previous total. But on the other hand, Tesla has 2 factories under construction right now, one in Texas and one in Berlin. So you can see that sales are going to increase dramatically over the next couple of years, whereas at all the other automakers, sales are in a big slump, like a big slump. And they say that it's because of shortages of parts, especially computer chips. But some people are questioning whether it might be a shortage of demand as well.
And while this isn't much financial, I guess if you're one of the world's richest people, this qualifies because Mr. Bezos is going to launch Captain Kirk into outer space. Canadian actor William Shatner at 90 will become the oldest person in space, but apparently not the first actor because the Russians are shooting a movie on the space station.
Yeah, the 11-minute journey into space may not be entirely into space. It's I think they said it was 80 kilometers, which is right on the edge of space, depending on what definition you believe. Some people say you have to go at least 100 kilometers to be into actual space, but 11 minutes. And the other people on the trip, I think there's 2 other people on that trip, are paying, and I don't know how much they have to pay. You can go on the website, Blue Origin, but it isn't immediately apparent what the cost is, but I'm sure it's quite expensive, in the millions of dollars probably. But I think Shatner is getting a free ride, so he's not a paying customer. He's a publicity stunt, I guess, is what he is.
Well, if anybody deserves a free trip into outer space, having publicized it before we actually started going into space on a regular basis, Star Trek.
Yeah, as long as he goes boldly, that's the main thing. Boldly.
Yeah. And will they be playing the Star Trek music as they go up? Or they don't have the rights, of course. Bezos could just buy the NBC studios, I guess. Hilliard, before we go, what's your overall feeling about the markets? We had that downturn a couple of weeks ago, then we had bounce back Friday. Does it look like the situation is normal, or is there a lot of turmoil and just a couple of companies keeping the stock markets in the green?
Yeah, it's a great question. The market's up today on Tuesday, but it had a big down day yesterday, so we're still lower. And I think on the month of September it was down something like 5%. So we're only 5 or 8% away from the all-time record highs, which were hit sometime in the summer. But it does feel like, and this is just there's no scientific way to prove this, but it does feel like maybe this market is getting tired. And the issues in China are not just Evergrande. There also is a big issue with electric power shortages, and the Chinese government forecast for GDP growth has been downgraded a couple of times. So China has been the engine of growth for the world GDP since about 2001. So with a slowdown in China, big slowdown in the U.S. automakers, they're on average, they're down by 20%, except for Tesla, of course, as we talked about, which is way up. But GM, Chrysler, Ford, they're all way down, like 20-25% in their sales. It does feel like the road ahead is going to be a little bumpy. And so far, what's happened every time we have these 5 or 10% dips is the buy the dip people come roaring in and save the market. Some of them on Robinhood, but there's all kinds of people that have learned that buying the dip has always paid off for them. But if you go back a few more years, like I do, there have been times when buying the dip has been painful. So what this market probably needs is a more significant sell-off, like 15 or 20%, to get prices. It's sort of like the housing market. It's way overbought. And we need to get prices back down to where they're more reasonable. And that's going to take a pretty significant sell-off. 10% wouldn't do it. It would have to be 20 or 30%.
Hilliard, thank you so much for chatting with us.
Thank you, Jim.
My guest has been Hilliard MacBeth, author of the second edition of the book, When the Bubble Burst, Surviving the Canadian Real Estate Crash. His website, MacBethMcLeodPartners.com. If you have any questions for Hilliard or any of our other guests, we'll ask that question for you if you send it to info@HoweStreet.com. Our YouTube channel is Talk Digital Network. Find us on Twitter @HoweStreet. We're also on Facebook. I'm Jim Goddard. Thank you for listening.
Comments made on HoweStreet.com radio are an expression of opinion only and should not be construed in any matter whatsoever as recommendations to buy or sell any financial instrument at any time. Available online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. HoweStreet.com radio is a production of HoweStreet Media Incorporated.